John, I'm going to hand it over to you, and you're going to share screen and all that. So thank you for doing this. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Elaine. And it's good to be here. Here meaning here in my basement office. About COVID, my commute was like just downstairs. So, and that was probably the same for all of you as well. As I am getting ready to share my screen, I just want to make it clear that I'm going to be, basically telling you my story, but even though it's my story, what I'm hoping is that you're going to find some common threads that you'll be able to take away and utilize in your writing life. And I should be able to get done in plenty of time to answer questions, and I'll just keep answering questions until Elaine tells me to shut up and go back home, go back upstairs. So you should see my name and my face. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay, let me make it full screen, and we're off. That's me. And we're going to the title of my talk, just for the sake of accuracy here, is From Journalist to Novelist, or How I Learned to Start Making It Up. I'm from La Crosse, Wisconsin. I think I may have mentioned that before, my Wisconsin roots. La Crosse, Wisconsin is on Wisconsin's west coast, otherwise known as the Mississippi River. That's a view of downtown La Crosse from the Minnesota Bluffs. So we're looking east, and La Crosse was a great place to grow up. About 40 or 50,000 people. It was big enough so that it wasn't monotonous, and it was small enough so that you weren't just anonymous. So it was a good place to grow up. That's Granddad's Bluff. That's probably the most prominent topographical, geographical feature other than the river. One of my novels is set there. La Crosse is well known for Heileman's Old Style beer. It's also the headquarters of the Train Heating and Air Conditioning Company, and that's the mom and dad. When they were married in 1938, they were married for 53 years. My dad was a lawyer. My mom was an elementary school teacher. And, one of the things that I've noticed, I do a lot of teaching now and get to know a lot of my students. And one of the things that really has gotten my attention over the years in listening to other people's stories is how much dysfunction there is out there, and how grateful I am that the home I grew up in was stable and that my parents loved each other and loved me. I would argue that it took me decades to realize how privileged I am. I grew up on second base. I was born on second base at a time when people couldn't even suit up, much less play the game. So I recognized late in life the privilege that and the entitlements that I had that I took for granted for way too long. My dad was born in Greece. He was born in a small village just to the west of Corinth. And my grandparents had their first kiss on the Acropolis in Athens, and then they came over to the U.S. The name was originally spelled Tentakis that way, and then it was Ellis Islanded to DeDakis that way in 1913 when my grandparents and my dad and his one of his younger brothers came over. And then there was a typo in the Chicago phone book in 1915, and the second D was accidentally capitalized. So my grandpa said in Greek, "That's cool, let's leave it." So so that at least that strain of DeDakis has the second D capitalized. It's not Dukakis or any other way of telling it. When Dukakis ran for president in 1988, we were living in Atlanta, and my wife was going through the checkout line at Publix, and she gave the checkout person her check. The woman looked at the name and she says, "Oh, Dukakis, are you related?" And Cindy said, "No, he spells his name D-U-K. Ours is D-E-D." The woman goes, "Oh, are you related?" So, it's hard to educate people. So I pretty much answered to anything. When I was in the Army, my first sergeant called me Dudakai. I said, "It's DeDakis." He said, "That's what I said, Dudakai." So good thing is I know who I am. Moving on. That's the mom and the dad 50 years later. They aged, I think, pretty gracefully. The interesting story there is that my mom died in 1991. And after my mom died, my dad and my Aunt Nita, who my mom's older sister, her husband had died just a few months after my mom did. And so my dad and Aunt Nita, that's the mom. And so after mom died, my dad and my Aunt Nita would talk to each other on the phone. She was in Houston, Texas. My dad was in La Crosse. And Aunt Nita told me years later, she said, I got so lonely that I got down on, it was so bad. I got down on my knees and I prayed that some nice man would come along and maybe we could be friends, and maybe it would even go more than that. And she said, the day after I prayed that prayer, your dad and I were talking and he proposed. So that was an answered prayer, right? So what do you suppose she did? She said to my dad, "Let me think about it." So she went to somebody, my Uncle Bud, and said, "Bud, George has just proposed. What should I do?" And my Uncle Bud said, "Well, Nita, you and George have been visiting each other in your homes. I mean, if you don't marry each other, people are going to think you're a floozy." So my dad the next day called Aunt Nita, waiting for his answer. And she said, "Well, George, if we don't get married, people are going to think I'm a floozy." And my dad's response was, "Well, Nita, what makes you think you're not a floozy?" So she said yes. That was my dad, Mr. Smooth. So I was at their wedding. That's a picture of them on their wedding day. And after they got married, I mean, that day I learned the word fuchsia, because that was the color of Aunt Nita's dress. It was beautiful. And they had 4 years together before my dad had a stroke and died in 1996. So little bypass there, just to kind of, give you a little family lore. That's me, Geek of the Year in 1956. We'll move on, because here's my point. And this, I think, is relevant to you as well. Life doesn't always turn out the way you expect. I mean, think about it. In real life, it's a crisis. In journalism, it's a story. But in fiction, it's a plot twist. And we all have plot twists. Every good story has things that happen unexpectedly, and your characters respond that way. And that is the exact same way that we live our lives. And so you can draw from personal experience and inform your fiction and your stories as you go forward. So in my case, the plan was that I was going to be a lawyer, go into practice with my dad, and then use the law as a stepping stone to get into politics. And if everything had turned out the way I had expected, this would have been where I lived for 8 years, 4 years, and maybe 8 years. But for the good of the country, I decided to go in a different direction. And that was one of the first plot twists, because I went to college at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in 1968. Those of you who know your history know that the Vietnam War was a big deal back then. It was in all the papers, and there was a draft. And that meant that people my age were getting plucked from society and thrown into the jungles of Vietnam. Needless to say, that caused quite a bit of an uproar on university campuses around the country. This is almost a typical day at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I'm not in the picture, but you kind of get the feel of the campus turmoil. And I think that one of the things that got me to start to change course in my life is that when I was on my way to class, I was bombarded from both the left and the right to take a position for or against the war. Never mind that I hadn't really had a chance to think it through. And the thing that bothered me is that the rhetoric from both sides was overheated. I just knew instinctively that whoever was trying to spin me was leaving out salient details that undermined their position. So journalism seemed to be the good perch to sit on to kind of figure out what the facts were. So I volunteered at a campus radio station, WSRM, and I was a reporter and co-news director. This is me covering a teaching assistant strike in the fall, I think, or the March of 1969 or so, something like that. And so, journalism was a great place to be. Covered a campus riot after Kent State. My parents, I got tear gassed, and my parents heard my report on the air, and they freaked out. And they called and they said, why don't you consider transferring? So I did, because I'd pretty much had it with the campus chaos. But the problem was that Playboy magazine voted UW-Madison the #1 party school in the country. And I saw it as my personal mission to be the #1 partier at the #1 party school. I didn't succeed, but I had so much fun trying that my grade point average was 1.94. I was that close to getting kicked out of school. And, oh, by the way, they had a draft, and if you had a number below 150, chances are you were going to be going to Vietnam. My number was 14. So when I made the transition from UW-Madison to La Crosse, I lost 20 credits in the transfer and my student deferment. So long story short, and I can make it longer, but I won't. Long story short, I enlisted to avoid the draft. Thought about going to Vietnam or to Canada, thought about going to jail. And there was a conversation that my parents and I had, and a real heart to heart. And I came to the conclusion that I wasn't really a conscientious objector. So I bit the bullet, so to speak, and enlisted. I had to stay in longer, but I had more control over what I do. So that's me with the bayonet between my teeth, my M16. Another plot twist coming up. I got orders to Vietnam. And, that was a major crisis. And 2 weeks before I was to ship out, my orders were changed to Germany. And I spent the next 2.5 years at the headquarters of the American Forces Radio and Television Network in Frankfurt, Germany, doing interviews for a special events radio unit run by Herb Glover, the guy on the right there. Herb used to work with Walter Cronkite at CBS, and Herb had a mentor's heart. And the first interview he assigned me to do was with this guy named Alfred Hitchcock. Maybe you've heard of him. I mean, think about it. I mean, Herb could have done the interview in his sleep, and instead he trusted this 21-year-old kid not to screw it up. And it was basically a life-changing experience, because I found what I was good at and what I loved. And when you put those two things together, you've really got some purpose and propulsion going forward in your life. So I got out of the Army, went back to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, got a degree in journalism, 3.5 average. I'm not brilliant, but I grew up in the experience. So obviously, I had changed. I no longer was going into law and politics. And my mom basically said, "You've lowered your sights, John." But she gave me some good advice for being a journalist. I call it the Ruth DeDakis rule of journalism. She said to me, "If I ever hear any bias in your reporting, even if it's an opinion I agree with, you failed. Just give me the facts and let me make up my own mind." And I mean, I think, and maybe you'll want to talk about journalism as we go forward, but I think her words are wise. They were wise then. They're still wise. Unfortunately, they're not being practiced nearly as much anymore in journalism. So that was the rule that I lived by. And there's an axiom in journalism that says, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. And I did, and she did. So I went into I started in radio, but I switched to television in 1976. This is me at WMTV in Madison, the NBC affiliate. You could probably caption this another reason why you shouldn't do drugs, or Buff Madison porn star. We'll move on. I went from Channel 15 in Madison to eventually covering the White House for the last 3 years of Reagan's presidency. This is from a piece that I was doing on the White House press corps versus the president. This is Larry Speake sitting at the Resolute desk with Reagan. And one of the takeaways from this piece is that I discovered that, it was Larry's job to make Reagan and his policies look perfect. It's our job as journalists to find out what's really going on. And that's the essence of the conflict and the friction that exists between the press and the president, no matter what party the president is in. All presidents hate their press coverage. And so that was one of the takeaways. Unlike what some presidents will tell you, it is a firing offense to make things up. So we won't dwell on that. But that was a great experience covering the White House. I went to CNN in Atlanta in 1988. Was at CNN for 25 years. I started there as a writer, but again, here's another plot twist. I was working nights and weekends, and one of the editors I was working with said, "Have you ever thought about being an editor?" I said, "No." He said, "You'd be a great editor." What he meant was, I want off nights and weekends, and you'd be a great warm body to replace me. So sure enough, I got the lousy overnight shift, and he got the great 9 to 5 shift. And I basically did overnights for probably the next 17 years. And it was a mixed bag. It was a good experience. I got to work with Carol Costello. She and I used to go play racquetball after work. We must have played about 30 times. And you know how many times I won? None. She is great at racquetball. She sucks at tennis, but she's great at racquetball. And she was just a fun person to work with. Went to DC, and I was one of Wolf Blitzer's editors for 7 years on the Situation Room. That's me holding the Peabody Award that we got for our coverage of the 2008 presidential election. This picture represents the nanosecond that I was allowed to hold the Peabody before they took the picture, and then I had to give it back to Wolf, because really he's the one who deserved it. He's smart enough that he can ad-lib the whole show, but he depended on writers and editors as well. And it was a great experience. But what I discovered about being an editor is that it's tedious. It pays well, but it's fault finding, basically. And I needed a creative outlet, because in journalism, it's like hockey and soccer in that you're a goalie, but in those two sports, everybody sees the great saves. In journalism, they're only aware of you if you let something bad get on the air, like an error in fact. Accuracy is job one in journalism. And that was one of the main things I had to guard against, or guard for. So while I was at CNN, probably back in the mid 90s, I started writing a novel. This is the very first novel I wrote. It took 10 years to get the agent that I've got. I got my agent in 2005, and we're still together. The novel, or the manuscript, went through 14 major revisions, and my agent is the 39th agent I queried. So the takeaway there is that if you take any of my writing classes, take good notes, because I'll save you 9 years in the process, because I made a lot of mistakes, and I learned a lot from the mistakes I made. That the company, the original publisher, went out of business at the beginning of COVID. By the way, I took the picture. This is a scene from the book. My protagonist is having a showdown with a freight train, and I lay in front of the train to get the shot. Most of the shots we weren't able to use because they were too blurry, because I was jumping out of the way all the time. But full disclosure, this train had stopped, and the engineer let me lie down in front of the tracks and take the shot. So the publisher went out of business, but amazingly, another publisher came on board, and so the book was reissued in 2021 with a new cover, but not really much changed other than getting rid of a couple of typos. Moving on, and this is another thing I want you to take away from this conversation, is that we write from places that we know, and we can also mine the personal pain that we go through. This is my sister Georgia, and the very first scene in Fast Track is the day my sister took her life. I was on the scene that day, and so writing about it was a catharsis. And so we'll come back to Georgia in a minute, but our society tends to anesthetize the pain, but we're writers and we deal in the truth. We deal in reality. Even though we're making things up, we're probably telling deeper truths than even journalists are able to tell, because we're really able to immerse ourselves in the lives of our characters in an intimate way. And so I would encourage you to, if you don't already, be able to mine that pain in your own life and weave it into something that's redemptive for other people. So another aspect of Fast Track that I draw from goes back to 1959, when my dad and I, that's me, still Geek of the Year, only in 1959 this time, and Dad and he would take me on the train to visit his dad in Chicago, and I loved to sit in the Vista Dome car. I'd sit in the front so that I could see the tracks ahead. And this was December of 1959. It was the middle of the night. The train was going about 90 miles an hour down the tracks, and we got to this crossing, and out of nowhere, a car came from off to the left and crossed in front of the train, and we hit it. All this debris comes down on the dome car. I ducked to get out of the way. The train comes to a stop. We killed 3 people in the car. Everybody in the car was killed. And as we were waiting for the wreck to be cleaned up, a woman was sitting next to me, and she's this is in the dining car, and she said, "I live near here. I'll send you a newspaper clipping of what happened." Well, 40 years later, I was still waiting for the newspaper clipping. And this goes to the power of the subconscious, because in the early days, when I was still trying to decide what my novel was going to be about, a writing prompt was, write about a personal experience. And so I started to just do a just the facts, ma'am, recitation of this accident that I witnessed. And as I was writing, I remembered a radio news report that I'd heard about the same time as the accident, 40 years earlier, about a similar car train collision in which an infant survived. And I began to play what if. What if that infant grew up and wanted to learn more about her dad and her past? And that became the essence of Fast Track, where my protagonist, her parents were killed in a car accident, and Lark, my protagonist, solves the mystery surrounding the crash. The wreck killed Raymond Stage, 11 years old, and I think that was another reason why it was so made such an impression on me, because someone almost my age was killed in the accident. And I mean, I'm a lot older now, and he never had a chance to experience, all the things that I did. But getting back to the story, it happened in Chadwick, Illinois. And so I named my protagonist Lark Chadwick. I write as a woman. We'll get to that in a minute as well. But this is the way guys look at Lark. When they see Lark, this is what they see. They see Linda Carter. You probably know her as Wonder Woman, but this is the way Lark sees herself. This is still Linda Carter, But Lark sees herself as a brain instead of a body. And so that is a source of endless friction between Lark and many of the men in her life. So that's one of the things that I navigate as a writer, and I take my character through those kinds of things. Second novel is Bluff. That I wrote after hiking the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu. I'd written 8 drafts. And I was looking at pictures of the Inca Trail, and I said, you know, I don't think I can fake this. I think I need to go there. And I did. And I knew by this time, I knew what the murder scene looked like. And so as soon as I saw it, I took the picture of it. This is not the murder scene. This is the murderer. It's the guy who wrote the book. So that shows me at Machu Picchu, but that's the murder scene, and I knew it as soon as I saw it. So I took the picture, and we used it in the cover. Same publisher as the other one that went out of business. So this is the redesigned, reissued book, and it's also an audio book, and we retained then the picture of the murder scene that I took. And Candace Fitzgerald does a fabulous job bringing Lark to life. Moving on, third novel, Troubled Water. Lark by this time is a journalist, and in this book she is the cops and courts reporter at a small kick-ass newspaper in South Georgia, and she discovers the body of a young girl who's been strangled, and it's the first victim of what becomes a serial killer's handiwork. And so Lark has the inside track in solving the problem. Another brief detour here. Let me introduce you to the family, because families are also great grist for fiction. That's my wife, Cindy, on the left. Cindy and I met way back in 1977 in Madison, Wisconsin. I joined the church choir just to get involved, and a year later, Cindy became the new choir director, and I've been taking direction ever since. And we've been married about 45 years now. Emily is, she has a PhD in creative writing. She lives in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and she's a freelance writer. She's been a dramaturg at the Accidental Theatre in Belfast. My son, James, he's a drummer, professional drummer. He was with the band Arizona, had a national following. He has since moved. He was in LA. He lives in Southern Oregon now, and he's starting his own video production company. And fortunately, he's staying with Cindy and I for this week. So we're treated to his presence. This is my son, Stephen. Stephen was a cook at a high-end restaurant, taught himself how to play drums and guitar, so he had a musical bent as well. But again, you draw from personal experience and you draw from your pain. And in this case, it didn't end well for Steve. The last month of his life, I learned that he was using heroin. And we had a heart-to-heart about it, and he was about to, turn his life around. But instead, he was missing for a week and was found dead in my car about a block and a half from our house in DC in August of 2011. And ironically, it was right next to a pole with a neighborhood watch sign on it. And so I draw from that pain. And while he was still missing, I dreamed of a bullet in a syringe because I knew heroin was going to be an issue. And my feeling was that if the cops can make the connection between the fatal dose of heroin and the guy who sold it to him, they should charge him with second-degree murder, with manslaughter, because it's the equivalent of selling a pistol with one bullet in the chamber to someone who's going to play Russian roulette and you don't care. But I found in researching the novel that it's not that easy. It's not a slam dunk for the cops to make that kind of connection. So that dynamic plays itself out in Bullet in the Chamber, which is my 5th novel. And by this time, Lark is a White House correspondent. Moving on. Oh, by the way, that also was made into an audiobook. Suzanne Soretta narrates that. Another fabulous voice actor, and she's working on making Fast Track come alive now. So we're not doing them in order. And then Fake is my most recent novel. Lark is a White House correspondent trying to navigate the Me Too era and fake news. She is the victim of fake news. And that book has also been made into an audiobook as well. So look, I want to give you a chance to ask some questions. So let me just throw a few little logs on the fire here to make you think. Here's why I write as a woman. There's a superficial reason and there's a deep reason, but it goes to the fact that we try to populate our novels with more than just one gender. I taught a writing class in DC not too long ago, and one of the guys said, and I appreciate his honesty, he said, "I do not understand women, therefore I don't write them." And I appreciated his honesty, but I remember thinking, dude, your books are probably very boring, because I find women are fascinating. So one of the things the reason I started writing as a woman is when I first started playing with fiction, someone suggested that I should write in a way that stretches who I am. Never been a woman, at least not in this life. So that's what I started doing. And I made some discoveries. I discovered that emotions are not gender specific. We all have the exact same emotions. It's just that in my experience, women are more willing to share their emotions. They have a more varied emotional palette. They seem to be more articulate about the way they express their emotions. And consequently, and I'm not trying to make a blanket observation. I'm just talking about from my own personal experience. In my experience, guys are pretty, yup, nope. They're not necessarily willing to share all that much about their emotions. So I find that when I was at CNN, that's 25 years worth of mostly young women in their early to mid 20s who would tell me their stories about their boyfriends and their careers and their families. And I would just pump them with questions about what's it like to be a woman and what's it like? And they would tell me. And then they became my beta readers as time went on. So I just found that women are incredibly interesting in the way they express themselves. So, and when you think about it, most novels are going to be populated, and not just by both genders, because we now live in an era of gender fluidity. We're not just binary anymore. It's probably always been this way, but now at least it's more in the public eye, where people are at various stages along the spectrum. And so some people are in transition and so on. We don't need to get into that, but the point is that the human experience is quite complex. And so I think that the more we are curious about the people around us, the more we're willing to ask questions about the people in our lives, the people we come across, that's going to fuel our subconscious. And that's our wellspring of creativity. So that's the essence, I think, of what it means to be a good writer, is to be curious about your surroundings and to ask questions. Now, there's a deeper reason I write as a woman, and that goes back to my sister, Georgia, because after Stephen died, I went through grief counseling for probably 2.5 years, which was a great experience because it's a safe environment and you can talk to them about anything. And so I came out of that grief counseling experience. And a year after I left grief counseling, they asked me to give a speech at a fundraiser for the Grief Counseling Center in DC. And this goes back to the subconscious again, because as I was writing my speech, I realized that there's a deeper reason that I write as a woman. And that's because I'm trying to create a character I wish my sister Georgia had allowed herself to become. because Georgia was she could have been a concert pianist. She was bright enough that she could have been a surgeon. And instead, her husband said, what would it look like, a football coach married to a surgeon? And so one by one, she gave up her dreams until 20 years into the marriage, she went into the garage, shut the door, turned on the car, and ended it. And so my protagonist doesn't let a guy define who she is. She still makes mistakes. She still falls for the bad boy, but she's not a victim. And so I learned a lot from grief counseling in tapping into my subconscious. And so, Lark is not Georgia, but she's the kind of person I think Georgia would have appreciated if she'd had a chance to read any of the novels. And who knows, maybe in some ways, she's been around, whispering in my ear as we go on. Last couple of points I want to make, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. I've talked about the power of the subconscious. And so let me zero in on this a little bit more, because the way I look at it, writing is like dipping a straw into your subconscious. And when you start to ask questions, what if this? What would it be like if this kid grew up and wanted to find out more about her past? Why do I do these kinds of things? When you ask questions, you're stirring up your subconscious. And then as you are creating characters, as you are writing, it's like taking a sip out of your subconscious and it goes through your fingers and onto the page. I mean, think of writing as dipping into your subconscious. Listen to those voices that show up. Interview your characters. If you're trying to come up with a new story, do a job interview. Who are you and why do you want to be in my book? And then listen to the question, listen to the answers that show up, and voices will show up. It doesn't mean you're crazy. You may be crazy, but you're also creative. And so when you listen to those voices, transcribe them. So if the guy says, I don't want to be in your book, what's the follow-up question? Why not? And so get them talking. Another thing is turn off your internal editor. We can be our own worst enemy. Our mom sitting on our shoulder saying, you can't write that. Zip it, Mom. I'm discovering what my story is. So just leave me alone, let it all come out. And then when it's this steaming pile of clay, you can mold it and edit things out and make it more coherent. I'm a manuscript editor and a writing coach. And one of the things I discover is that usually first-time writers, their writing is kind of stilted and it's, they try to be writerly. And my advice is don't write to be fancy, write to be clear. If your background is technical writing, great, because now you know how to be precise about how to identify things and show things. So use that writing experience that you've already got and then just apply it. If you've got a journalism background, great, you already know how to write tight. But even if you've never been a writer before, listen to the way you tell stories, listen to the way people tell stories to you, and then just write to be clear. You don't have to be fancy. That's because the way you find your voice is it's already there. And if you are unpretentious about it, your writing will probably flow a lot more easily. Probably the biggest impediment I've found to writing is this fear of perfection. I mean, you can be crippled when you're looking at that empty page and you're deciding, should it be first person? Should it be third person? My advice is, if you've never written a book before, write it first person for the first draft. Why? Because that's your comfort zone. That's how you already communicate. A lot of the manuscripts I edit are in third person and they feel clunky because the writer's not used to writing that way. Now, maybe your story, and once you get the whole story written first draft, you may decide, well, this is not going to work. Then you can do your third person. But if you're afraid of making mistakes, that's going to cripple you. Accept it. It's not going to be perfect. So deal with that. because the best way to overcome writer's block, which is basically fear paralyzing you, the best way to overcome writer's block is to write. And that's where I'll leave it. That's me. That's how you can get in touch with me. Yes, it's AOL. Get over it. I still get emails through AOL. And that's my website, johndedakis.com. And I will stop sharing my screen. And if anybody is left, oh, look at all of you. I'll take questions until Elaine tells me to shut up.
Well, I want to thank you. That was wonderful, very informative, and inspiring.
Thank you.
Wow. Come to Imaginarium and we'll go out to dinner.
All right, that's a deal.
And just a reminder, everybody, if you want to ask a question, don't forget to unmute.
Yeah.
Because most everyone's muted right now.
Yeah.
All right, I have a question.
Okay.
Have you ever written a character, a protagonist in particular, but somebody that has a pretty big role in one of your stories that you don't particularly like, but they're a good character, like you're having trouble liking this character?
Oh, sure.
How'd you get past that?
Well, if they're the villain, you don't have to like them.
Not.
Yeah. I don't know if I can give you an easy answer. But it is, I want to go back to real life, because there are people in our lives we're stuck with and we may not like them and they may not be likable. But one of the things that keeps eating at me, and I'll mention politics just briefly without going into detail, I'm a common ground kind of person. I really strongly feel that even when we disagree with someone, we should really see if we can find common ground. And unfortunately, I think with the political climate that we're in, I don't know if that's possible politically, at least for now, because we live in two different fact-based worlds. But I think that it's still possible to find common ground on a human level, in terms of, people love their families. They care about their families, their kids. They care about prosperity, their jobs, their health. So there are many things that we can find that are in common. And I think that one suggestion I'll give you for your writing is, if you do come across one of those unlikable characters, instead of, take a break from writing and do an interview with them. And really be honest with them about, this is what I don't like about you. Help me understand why you're like that, and see what shows up. Because you may end up gaining more empathy for that character. They may still be an asshole, but at least you understand why.
Thanks.
You're welcome. I hope that helped.
I do like your idea about interviewing the characters. That's not something I had thought about, but that would be a wonderful way to fill out that character sheet that you have.
Right.
Where were you born? What kind of an education did you have? Who was your best friend? And why was that person your best friend?
Absolutely. You're asking absolutely the right questions. And you don't have to shoehorn all this information into your story, but it informs you. And that way you'll be able to write with more intelligence and understanding about the character.
I want us to take 1 second to say hello to Rhonda, who joined us. This is her first time at the meeting, and she lives in Connecticut and wants to be a member of the Derby Rotten Scoundrels in Kentucky. So
Hey.
there you go. Welcome, Rhonda.
Thank you. Thank you. Put the mic down, Rhonda. Yeah, I grew up in Grant County, and I went to Eastern Kentucky University, and I lived in Lexington for a couple of years. And I'm writing about Kentucky. It just stays with you, So thank you for the warm response, and I've enjoyed what I was. I apologize for having arrived late, but I enjoyed what I saw, and I'll definitely be tuning in for the recording. Thanks.
John, I had a question.
Sure.
You mentioned that you made lots of mistakes when you were first writing, as have we all, and you continue to make them. But what I was wondering about is, what do you wish that you had known about becoming a novelist that you didn't know when you started out?
Boy, first I have to think a long way back. That's part of it.
Yeah.
I think that there are a couple of things. One is I don't think I realized how long it would take.
Mhm.
I think that I was very naive about what the expectations were. I expected that, that it would become a bestseller and that I'd make a lot of money. Boy, is that not true. I mean, when you think about it, there are like something like 20,000 books a day that are published. I mean, that may be a little extreme, but not much. And so it is a lifelong effort then to market yourself. And so marketing was something that I wasn't really expecting either.
Yeah.
And I think, and there's one other thing, and that is when it came time to go getting an agent, I would go to a writing conference that was at the University of Georgia. And I think for the longest time, I was in fear and intimidated by the agents who were there, the people a lot farther along in the experience. And I pedestalized them. And I think that that was a mistake because you forget that they're people too.
Yeah.
And that moment came when I was sitting just shooting the breeze with an agent, and I realized, we were talking about our kids, and I thought, well, this is just a normal conversation. And so I think if you can approach the marketing and because that's a form of connection, and finding an agent as just relationship based, that I think demystifies a lot of it. It's just the normal interaction between people. How's that for ducking the question?
That was great. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Anyone else?
Well, I'll ask another question. John, I was wondering about your writing process. Do you tend to start with a premise or your character, or and how much planning do you do, and all that stuff? I'm always interested in how other writers, what they do, because I've discovered that all of us are very different.
Very different. I like to know where I'm going. So I'm a planner, but usually what happens is when I start, I know where it's going to go, but more often than not, when I'm writing, I discover that I hadn't planned nearly as meticulously as I'd hoped. And so usually about, I don't know, around the midpoint, I'm having trouble getting from one point to the next point. I may know how it's going to end, but getting there is the trick. And what I've discovered two things. One, procrastination is a thing. And it's actually pretty helpful, because when you're ruminating about your writing, you're still writing, you're thinking about it. And I think the big misnomer is that you have to be, writing and in the front of the computer in order to be a writer. No, if you're thinking about it, that's still part of the process. But there comes a time when you still need to get down to business. And what I've discovered then is I write and I get the characters talking to each other, and that moves the story along. So I have just enough light for the next step. And so instead of being a planner, I'm a plantser. I'm a seat of the pantser and a planner. And that's probably on steroids now in the 6th novel that I'm working on, because I don't have a clue how it's going to end. I don't really know who the bad guy is, but I had a great idea that launched the book. and it got me through the midpoint. And now I'm just seat of the pantsing my way to the end. I've had to take actually a hiatus as I ruminate a couple of things, but I think QAnon is probably going to play a part. I think mental illness is going to play a part. I just haven't found a coherent way to make that weave that into the story. So I guess the bottom line is that I'm kind of flexible in my process. I'm not rigid and only doing it a certain way. And I think that is a sort of a helpful way to be.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good question. Are we having fun yet?
Yeah.
Yes.
I am.
Does anyone else have any questions? Well, again, I will say thank you very much. It was very, very interesting.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
I hope to see you on down the road, as they say.
Thank you.
In
Well,
person.
this has been fun. And I hope that, if you've got, some people are a little shy about asking questions in a larger group, but you've got my name and, my website and my email address. So, you're certainly welcome to reach out to me one-on-one.